Hello.
Hey.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We'll give folks another minute or two. I know there were a couple people trying to log in who are having the same Zoom room issue that we've been having all year. So hopefully we can get that resolved and get folks in. And hopefully
Hey everybody,
we
I
won't
am still
need
with
to,
little one, so I am going to turn off my camera and mute, and as soon as they're gone, I'll turn it back on.
no worries. Thanks, Daryl.
Hey, Rebecca, it's Sarah Cook. I'm on, but I'm on my phone, so I'm on my phone now.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. All right. I think that we've got a pretty good group here. I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody while we kick things off and do attendance. And then I will hand it over to Shaiki. All right. So Cecilia? You might need to unmute. I thought I saw you, Cecilia. Oh, we lost her. She's coming back in. All right, Jennifer.
I'm here.
Clark?
Yes, here.
Cecilia? We're just doing roll. I'm back. Cheryl. Beth?
Here.
Kristen? Tina?
Here.
Becky?
Present.
Angie?
Here.
Daryl is here. Gina?
Here.
Vivian? Michelle?
Here.
Miriam? Thea? Oh, we'll come back. Bergen? Sandy?
Here.
Karen? Oh, Sandy, got you. Karen? Sarah's here. Grace?
Here.
Roberta?
Here.
And Angela. Angela let me know she would not be here today. All right, Cecilia, are you able to unmute? Are you with us?
Hello? Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Awesome. And Cheryl, are you able to unmute? Are you with us?
Yes, I am here. Thank you.
Great. And then Miriam, I saw you come in.
Yes. Hi.
Wonderful. All right, we're all set. I will hand it over to you, Shaiki.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everyone. Rebecca, did you get both Jennifers? Jennifer Parrish and Jennifer, I believe, McDonald.
Jen McDonald is here.
Awesome.
Okay. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all. We do have hopefully you received all of your materials for today's meeting. If you had an opportunity to browse it, we do have a packed agenda for today, and we are going to attempt to get through as much of it as we can without overwhelming anyone. We'll start with the approval of the agenda. If we have a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
I'm sorry, I did not hear the motion.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I thought there was a motion. I didn't hear that. I'm sorry.
This is Clark. I'll motion.
Thank you. Motion made by Clark. Do we have a second?
Roberta, yeah.
Thank you, Roberta. Motion made by Clark, second by Roberta. All those in favor can say aye or give me an emoji.
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Ayes have it, motion carried. Thank you. Next, we'll have the approval of our September meeting minutes. Do you have any questions or corrections to the minutes? If not, we'll entertain a motion to approve them as presented.
So moved.
Motion by Cheryl. You have a second?
Second.
Second by Jennifer. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Ayes have it, motion is carried. Thank you so much. We are so excited to welcome our newest member of ECAC, and I will yield to Rebecca to do the introductions, and then we'll hear from our new member.
Awesome. Thanks, Shaiki. So yes, we are so excited to be able to welcome Ms. Tina Alsup from the Henrico County Public Schools, who is now going to be representing Head Start providers on the committee. So Tina, I will hand it over to you and have you introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about what made you interested in joining the committee. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm excited to be here today, excited for this opportunity when it came around. And probably the biggest interest is because I have a passion for ensuring we have opportunities provided for all of our children in across the United States, but in Virginia especially. And there, so when this opportunity came, it's a great way to be involved with our youngest students, our youngest stakeholders out there that we're building for the future and ensure we have opportunities across the board for each and every one of them. So I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, and welcome again, Tina. We look forward to working with you as we all share in that same passion, and so we look forward to the work ahead, which leads us to our 2022 schedule. Rebecca?
Yes, thanks, Shaiki. So we don't have an actual schedule to share, but really what we just wanted to kind of raise up for you all is that, so, looking ahead to 2022, we obviously treated our 2021 schedule a little differently and acknowledged at the beginning of the year that we would meet more frequently and have kind of more frequent update oriented meetings while we were all getting to know one another, getting to know the system, hearing about the transition and all of the work that was underway at DOE. So, looking ahead to 2022, we want to continue to be as maximally flexible as we can with your busy schedules, with your important work that you do during the day. But we will be looking to move to a primarily in-person meeting setting. And in order to, vote on items, we will have to have a quorum in person in order to be able to endorse and move items forward to the board. So I say all of that just to say that, we will be reaching out in the next couple of weeks with some kind of general timeframes and recommendations for timing of the meetings next year. We'll strive to do fewer meetings, but they may be a little longer so that, we can make your trip to Richmond, if it is a trip to Richmond, a worthwhile time. As I think Jennifer had raised a smart point previously. We'll be able to cover parking, and if there are any questions about how to handle travel expenses or anything along those lines, we can discuss that in more detail, and we'll send information over email as we kind of have established a schedule. But we'll be looking to you all for your feedback on the times that will work best, and so that we can try to have a quorum in person at each meeting in 2022. So stay tuned for more information from us on that within the next few weeks.
Thank you, Rebecca. We look forward to the opportunity to meet in person. We will get right into our presentations, and I'll turn this portion of the meeting over to Jenna.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is great to see all these faces, and it's exciting to hear about 2022 and the possibility of working with you all in person. Welcome, Tina. Welcome to the Early Childhood Advisory Committee. We've got a very full agenda for your first meeting. As Shaiki noted, it is full of updates. So as you saw in the slides that you received, there's a lot of information. My goal for today is to help make that information understandable. There's a lot going on, and also to not talk too fast. As I watch the time ticking by, and knowing how excited I can get, I can start to talk too fast, and so I'll make sure to ask Shaiki to slow me down if I start going at rapid speed. But it's great to have everybody, and I'm just very excited on behalf of our bigger and broader team now to welcome everybody. I also saw Dr. Mann, our board member, is on this afternoon, so huge thank you to Dr. Mann for listening in, as we do have some of the materials that we are sharing, particularly on the work session. We will also be sharing with the board, and we really appreciate, as the charge of this group, right, is to serve as an advisory board member to the board. And so we just appreciate your presence today. So starting right in, I'd love to give everybody some updates on the Child Care Stabilization Grant Program, which we gave you a snapshot of where we were the last time we met, and just wanted to provide some progress on where we are today. Next slide, please. So as a way of reminder, the American Rescue Plan through the US Congress provided billions of dollars, $1 billion to the states to provide direct assistance to child care programs. Virginia received just over $480 million, of which at least $440 million is expected to go directly to child care providers. In the spring, we then had to have those dollars appropriated by our General Assembly in August, and we are very pleased to let this advisory body know that we launched the program last week on Monday, November 1st, using a brand new technology platform for all of our providers. And we had more than 1,000 providers, which is roughly 16% of those who are eligible, apply on the first day. So we've been a little busy in the last week. And then as of today, so notice this has been even updated from the slides that you received, we have received nearly 2,800 applications. So very, very excited. And we've approved more than 900 awards to child care programs, which already represents $61 million. And so I think, you know, we're excited to have this process flowing, and we also know that this extreme interest really reflects some of the challenges that our partners in the field continue to face. And so we feel real urgency as we work to get through every application, get dollars flowing. I'll talk a little bit more about the program as we move to the next slide, but are really focused on getting to everybody who's eligible this month so we can make sure that they receive the maximum amount of dollars. So you might ask who's eligible, just as a way of reminder. Much of this was set forth in federal law, so there's not a lot of Virginia discretion here, but basically we know approximately who's eligible because it's licensed, registered, or otherwise regulated as of March 11th. You've got the list here of the different types of program in Virginia, or if you are an approved child care subsidy program. So it's either, if you're in either one of these categories. What that means is that our programs that may not have been registered, licensed, or approved by March 11th, there's still an opportunity for them to receive funding if they become an approved child care subsidy program. Two different pathways to being eligible, and open and temporarily closed programs are eligible. You know, we're nearly everybody in the Commonwealth is back open, even if they temporarily closed last year. But even for those last few programs that may still be experiencing difficulties, if they're still temporarily closed, they remain eligible for some funding. Next slide, please. This gives you a sense of who's not eligible. So if you're exempt for licensure, with the exception of the CDs, the religious exempt child day centers and the certified preschools, if you're run by a school division, if you're directly run by a Head Start grantee, and we're working very closely with our Head Start grantees, largely because the federal guidance indicates that if you're receiving American Rescue Plan dollars for every kid through your Head Start grant, that they did not want there to be duplication with the child care funding. And so we're working that out with many of our Head Start partners. We know that there's different arrangements across the state. If you just became operational after March 11th and you are not an approved subsidy vendor, and any of our programs that are permanently closed. And again, there's very few programs that fit in that category in Virginia, but there are a handful. Next slide, please. And again, 440 million, so ballpark, so folks understand we ran 4 rounds of CARES grants over the course of the pandemic. Again, this was direct cash assistance. You know, at our max, I think we served just over 4,300 programs, and that was about $200 million across all 4 rounds. This is more than double that. If you think about $440 million, and we're focused on just over 5,000 providers who we think might be eligible, and we would like to get to every last one of them and support them to apply. There are some more federal expectations attached to these dollars, but there still remains a lot of flexibility. And what we're encouraging the field to do is to use these towards operational costs, whether that's staffing. We'll talk a lot today about the staffing crisis, wages, benefits, bonuses, tests, PPE, rent, utilities, maintenance, equipment and supplies, goods and services, mental health services. So really quite a bit of flexibility. And we heard loud and clear from the field that flexibility was important because different people have different needs. And you know, as long and the parameters are pretty broad by the federal government, but we, along with our partners at the Early Childhood Foundation, will continue to advise the field to support them to use these dollars. There will be 3 rounds. The first big due date is November 30th. We're working really closely with the field to get in all of the applications by November 30th, so we're eligible for the maximum amount of dollars. And then there will be 2 additional rounds for the course of the 9-month program. Next slide, please. We are doing a lot of outreach. We will spare you all. I think Becca and I did a 45-slide presentation on Monday, which we will spare this group because we have so many other topics to cover, but we've got those webinars. Those webinars are recorded. We've got a frequently asked questions. We've got a user guide. We're working very closely with the Early Childhood Foundation to create a tutorial. And we will also be doing a webinar next Monday, and you know, as well as sort of sending out updates via emails, sort of that. So please, if you have not signed up for Readiness Connection, please make sure to do that. And we have a special microsite or website for this. So again, we ask for your help as the advisory committee in getting the word out there. This is not first come, first serve. We have budgeted and are prepared to serve every program that we think may be eligible, and we will work over the course of this month and really the next 8 months to reach out to. We have a new outreach team at the Department of Education, a bilingual team, reach out to every last provider to make sure that they're aware of and have the opportunity to apply, and we'll support them every step of the way. So really pleased just to give you that update. It is launched. We have thousands of applications. We are working around the clock and through the holidays to begin to, in partnership with VCF, cut checks and on subsequent rounds, direct deposit to get this to providers, because we know you all, as the broadly representative group, are hearing from the field that this continues to be an incredibly difficult time to operate, and that the sector needs assistance, and that direct, flexible financial assistance is of the greatest. Let me pause there, Shaki, and see if we have any questions about the Child Care Stabilization Grant Program.
I don't see any chat box.
One quick thing that I do just want to note, as we've been continuing to monitor questions coming through in the Child Care Grants email. I do just want to make sure that folks are aware that we are in close communication with our partners in the licensing division, of course, as well as the team that manages the subsidy vendor approval process at DSS. So that we can stay in close communication and ensure that any newly eligible programs, so programs that may have not been eligible when we kind of did an initial pull of our records and established eligibility, but who maybe recently became a subsidy vendor or who experienced a change in their kind of regulated status. So maybe they held one regulated status and then transitioned to become a licensed provider and had no break in service. So we are working hard to identify those folks so that we can, again, as Jenna said, try to get as many eligible providers in the system as possible. We ask for folks to let us know if they receive any communication indicating ineligibility and they think that that's an error, because we are, like I said, ready and prepared to address that to get folks added into the system. We just don't have, immediate data feeds between all of our systems, so it's not an automatic process. We've just got to pull a couple strings to make it happen, but we are ready and prepared to do so on a regular basis. I also just want to assure anyone, if you become a subsidy vendor before November 30th and we are unable to get you into the system before the deadline, you would not be penalized for that. We could still process your first quarter application. Just want to be sure that, I know folks are excited about these resources and eager to get their applications in and approved. And I just want to assure providers that any delay on our end, we will not penalize you for that. So we are working as hard as we can to get everybody's first quarter applications that's eligible to receive them.
Shaki, a question from Cheryl. Do we know the percentage of Family Day Home applications received? Want to make sure that they are trickling in. Maybe Becca can look into that. That's a great question. And one of the unique things about our system is we're using a more modern piece of technology for this round. And so Becca has access to a dashboard, which she can track in real time how many applications we've received. And so we can look into that, and we're tracking right by program type, by area of the state. So again, right now we're mostly responding to what has come in. We'll pivot by the middle of the month and start to look at where we've not received applications and how to do more intensive outreach to reach everybody that might be eligible. I would, to Cheryl's point, for both our colleagues on the meeting and anybody who might be live streaming this, encourage folks to get on there and apply. You can't break the system. We've told we can have as many people apply as possible. And I know sometimes we're all deadline driven and we might be like, well, I'll apply tomorrow or next week. And whether it's your email first goes to spam, or there's a little bit, you might, have a little trouble logging in, or whatever it might be, right? We just encouraging everybody to get on there and apply. Again, it's not first come, first serve, right? We'll get to everybody, but we just, it helps us if folks apply in advance of November 30th, right? To understand where people are not aware and where they might need additional help versus somebody who might just putting it. So again, we ask for your help as an advisory committee to help us get the word out there that go ahead and apply. It's a pretty simple process, fairly straightforward. You don't have to upload any documents. There's a help desk available during the week. That is receiving hundreds upon hundreds of emails, and we still stand ready to support people. I'd also like to do a shout out to Becca and the team for standing this up in incredibly short order, and then a special appreciation to our providers who not only advised us every step of the process, but also helped us test the system, which involves a lot of acronyms and words that I don't even fully understand. But I know from Dr. Mann to others, having actual Virginia providers look at our system, look at the screenshots, help us build a better system, and then test that system, I think helped enable a smoother launch. And just as we know you guys have so many things on your plate, and we're incredibly grateful to all of the providers who helped us build this system. And we again remain committed to getting to every last eligible provider between now and the end of the month.
Jenna,
And Cheryl,
question.
I can tell you that, Cheryl, I can just say we have about 40% of the applications received have come from family day homes, and that includes licensed, voluntarily registered, and local ordinance.
Clark?
Yeah, thank you. Does the application process continue in the second quarter and the third quarter, or is this a one-time application that's done by November 30th and then you do nothing else on the application side?
That is true, Clark. So it is a one-time, you apply once and then the other checks, will come automatically. The exception if something substantively changes, right? So if you shift addresses, if your capacity goes up, if you take subsidy, you should reach out to us. But if nothing changes, then you don't have to do anything else. So the real push right now is to get everybody in the system by November 30th. Great point, Clark.
And if you don't apply by November 30th, you can still submit an application and be considered for a second and third quarter grant award. But November 30th is the deadline to receive all 3 payments. But once you apply once, then you're good.
Excellent. All right. With that, I'll go ahead and move to our next update. So our neast update is a presentation that we would like to share with you. This is not a decision item these are just a set of materials that we will be sharing with our Board of Education. It's called a working session. And as we really help our board, and under a lot of leadership from Dr. Mann, sort of understand what it means to be a board that's not just overseeing K-12, right, but the entirety of the early childhood system. We wanted to start with a focus on access and choice, right, and really providing some baseline information and insights about where we are in Virginia, as well as to get them thinking about some strategy. So that's an important preface as we move to the next slide and talk about this content. So this is the exact content that I will be presenting to the board next week. Again, not a decision item, right? They're not deciding on any particular policy as it relates to access or choice, but helping them understand where we are, this landscape around eligibility, funding, and choice, kind of across the programs. Some strategies that we've been thinking about that we've often heard from you, from the field, and then some of this kind of data on access and enrollment statewide. Next slide, please. We'll start, as we always do, with what unites us, right, in terms of our shared vision and challenge. And we know that, at least based on last year's data, right, and we'll see, we don't quite have this fall's information yet, but almost half of our children are coming into kindergarten without the opportunity to have built the key literacy, math, and social emotional skills needed to be successful. And we want to change that narrative. We as the adults that oversee and manage and administer this system want to figure out how we continue to strengthen the system to make sure that all Virginia children have the opportunity to enter school ready. We know that there's a couple of factors, right, that go into this that we have to tackle. One is about affordable access and ensuring that families across our public-private system can choose the option that meets their needs, whether that's in a home-based setting, a center-based setting, a school-based setting, a Head Start-based setting. We know that we want to support all of our programs that take public funds to serve our kids who are furthest from opportunity to benefit from measurement and supports for improvement, ensuring that we have quality options for all of our families. We want to continue to reward our programs for the incredible efforts made to continually improve on health, safety, and learning. And as we'll talk a little bit more today, to continue to tackle the issue of educator compensation and some of the disparities that exist. And ultimately, we imagine a more unified system where we're bringing data to groups like you, that we're advising the board, and we're figuring out how we support all of our families to go to work, go to school, pursue employment, greater self-sufficiency for their families, while we're giving children, no matter where you're born, what your zip code is, what family you're born into, the opportunity to be successful. Next slide, please. With that in mind, a sort of more simple way to think about this is helping folks understand that there's really two aspects of this. And you all, as our experts in the field, understand this. There's a part that's thinking about access, right? This is not like K-12, right, what the board is more familiar with, where anybody who wants to can always have a spot in the K-12 system, right? We've got to tackle both this issue of making sure that there are enough spots for the families and children that are eligible for and need them, and that those slots or those spots, right, are of sufficient quality, right, and continually improving. That's the way that we make sure that there are more options for families, and that we ultimately, working together kind of across our public-private system, can improve our school readiness outcomes. Next slide, please. So you all are very familiar with this. We go to the next slide again. In terms of our programs, we want to make sure that our board is fully kind of understanding, right, that some folks might think of early childhood and they think childcare. Some folks might think of early childhood and they think pre-K, and really helping understand there's 5 key programs that are part of our publicly funded system. We'll have an appendix for them that kind of provides detail of each one, but really understanding that, fundamentally our system is a mix of programs rather than just one particular program type, right? As you all have reminded us many times, this is about way more than just schools, right? And we think about the early childhood system. Next slide, please. Also, it's important to note that, kind of why is it so complicated? And I want to just, again, this is probably very familiar to you all, but helping our board understand how it's a little different from K-12, right? I already said this before, it's not guaranteed, right? That we have limited funding and we have eligibility requirements that are used to then prioritize who might be in most need or could benefit most. We know we've got a public-private system that's a little, that's slightly different, and we've got very diverse providers, right? And we've also got diverse family preferences, and really kind of we've done across communities across the Commonwealth, we're trying to build systems that really meet those families where they're at. And we also know that there's important historical context, right? When we think about things like our Head Start programs and the efforts, the important work that they've led in the United States for more than 50 years to serve our most underserved children and families. When we think about the origins of the Child Care Subsidy program and really how private providers have stepped up and ensure that there are childcare options for infants and toddlers, preschoolers, before and after school, so that our families who are working or in school can afford childcare and have choice. And really think, it fundamentally is a more complicated system, but that's also what makes it so fantastic. Next slide, please. So as I noted before, helping folks understand that there are these 5 sort of main programs, are kind of funding sources for publicly funded programs. All of these are probably very familiar to you: Vpi, Early Childhood Special Education, Mixed Delivery, Head Start, Early Head Start, and then the Child Care Subsidy program, which we know again is distributed across religious exempt, certified preschools, child day centers, and family day homes. Next slide, please. We will also, I think, helping our board understand, right, this is more than just schools, right? And when you think about infants and toddlers and preschoolers, it's important to understand it's a different context. We also want to help them understand that it's not sort of just because you're publicly funded, it doesn't necessarily mean that every child in there is publicly funded, right? Or that, you know, it's all like a public school. So kind of just 3 simple, extremely simple examples, right? But just helping kind of our board understand, right? When you think about something, for instance, on requirements that you might place on programs that take public funds, to understand that every child in that classroom might not actually receive the public funds, right? And so in recognizing, particularly when we think about our private partners, you might have, you know, the majority of your classroom, the children in your classroom, such as in class B here, might be private pay, right? And when you think about some of the expectations, recognizing, right, that the government, right, doesn't necessarily pay for every child, and being extremely thoughtful about what strings or expectations we're attaching to public dollars, you know, is critical. And I know this is something we've talked a lot about as it relates to things like the Unified Measurement and Improvement System, and being very thoughtful about how the early childhood context is different, say, than the K-12 accreditation system. Next slide, please. It looks simple, you know, now that I look at it, I'm like, oh my gosh, and I have to present this publicly. Maybe it's not that simple, but I think also kind of helping folks understand, you know, who would want these services. And a lot of that functions around eligibility criteria, right? So fundamentally, funding is limited. And so we end up setting these criteria on who we want to prioritize. However, as we've seen with the Virginia Preschool Initiative over the last few years, if you expand who's eligible, right, when we really focus on who may not have the opportunity to come to school ready, like you put more families in the mix, right, who would want that service if they were eligible. The other point that sort of the other factor that really affects demand is, do we have options that meet family needs? And I know our private providers in particular, you know, recognize this as important, whether it's families would prefer something in a smaller home-based setting for their younger children, like infants and toddlers, or close to them, or that speak the language that they speak, whether it's our working families, myself included, who need way more than 5.5 hours a day as it relates to care for my 4-year-old, right, and need full day, full year. And so as we think about ultimately how many families would take up these services, we think about both how do we set eligibility criteria and how do we make sure that we have enough options that really meet family needs. You know, if families need full-time care, but all we're offering is part-time, they're going to say, well, I'll go elsewhere, right? And so that can affect demand. And so thinking about both aspects of that. And then if you take that demand and then you think about how much we fund each child or each slot at, that really represents your potential public investment. So again, this work slightly different from K-12 and helping our board understand these parameters be a top priority for next year. Next slide, please. So just a chart here, probably most of you recognize my ask here. I'm not going to go through every aspect of this, but if you see anything that's off, let us know so we can fix it in time for the board. But again, helping understand that due to how a program is structured or who they're intended to serve, if there's some slight differences in age, who's eligible, what we expect in terms of the kid and what factors about the kid might make you eligible, what factors about the family might make you eligible in terms of things like childcare subsidy, and then how much flexibility there is in eligibility. So as we think about what we're trying to inspire the board to think as we set policies going forward, how might they might want to adjust eligibility where possible to kind of potentially increase or shrink the kind of number of families that might be a part of this demand. Next slide, please. And then the other part of my quote unquote simplified formula is then the per child funding, right? And so when you think about how you get to what is the potential public investment, you think about the demand side, and that's really sort of a function of eligibility and options. And then the other side is the per child funding. And so as you see here, quite a bit of variability in how we fund children right now. And we know that this is such a big factor. And when we'll continue to engage this group and our board on getting to a place where there's more alignment and consistency, as well as when we're actually able to fund programs in a way that meets the cost, right, rather based on the market or maybe to some other kind of not as effective mechanism. Next slide, please. All right, so with that, that kind of lays the groundwork. What I'd like to do now is walk you through some slides that we're going to share with them. But just some insights when you sort of think about, well, what does that mean, right, for what's actually occurring on the ground in Virginia? Go to the next slide, please. So I think the first one, we talked a bit about demand, is that, fundamentally we've got more demand than we've got slots. So let me take you through this chart. So Virginia is mathematically pretty simple. There's about 100,000 kids per age cohort. So that means kind of, 6 and under, you've got about 600,000 kids from birth to age 5, excuse me. And of that, roughly half are below 300% of the federal poverty level. You want to kind of use that as a general barometer. I know that doesn't necessarily line up, right, with eligibility for all of the programs. That doesn't necessarily make you eligible for Head Start, early childhood special education. But as a general ballpark number, here's how many folks we think some children may be eligible for some form or would benefit from some form of publicly funded early childhood programming. And yet, when you look at that and how many actually kids we serve, right, it drops down pretty precipitously. We've got about 90,000 kids underneath the federal poverty line, that's driven our deep poverty. And then across all of our age bands, we've only got about 70,000 publicly funded slots. So, again, there's a huge gulf between how many slots we serve versus the total population. Even when you look at need and you assume something kind of general, you look at 300,000 potential kids and families in need, birth to 5, and again, across our birth to 5 spectrum, roughly 70,000 slots, right? So you see a pretty tremendous gap between what might be demand for these slots and what we currently provide. The other key point when we break down the 70,000 slots is they're not equally distributed across the birth to 5 spectrum. And so this basically says that of those slots, about 16% serve infants and toddlers, so pretty small number. The vast majority, 62%, support preschoolers, that's 3 and 4-year-olds, and then about 22% of these support school-age children. And so that's an important note. We mostly talk about birth to 5 in the context of this advisory committee, but our child care subsidy program actually plays a really important role in terms of enabling parents across the Commonwealth to be able to afford a quality after school care for kids from age 6 to 12, and then a little bit older for children with special needs. So this chart basically shows the yellow is infants and toddlers, the black is preschooler, the red is school age. So you see Head Start, child care, CCSP is the child care subsidy program, Vpi is the Virginia Preschool Initiative, and the mixed delivery. You see that the vast majority of these slots support 3 and 4-year-olds. And so when you really think about of the 300,000 kids in need and how many of them are infants and toddlers, we serve a very, very small percentage for infants and toddlers. Next slide, please. That said, we still have pretty significant unmet need, even in preschool. And so, we're hearing a lot, whether it's in Virginia, about the marijuana revenues in a few years coming to support preschool for at-risk 3 and 4-year-olds, whether it's hearing about Build Back Better at the federal level or other efforts, across, whether you're just hearing on the sort of the child care staffing crisis and folks looking for care in child care, like we still have a tremendous amount of unmet need for 3 and 4-year-olds. So when we look roughly, again, at 3 and 4-year-olds under 300% of the federal poverty level, 1 in 3 lack access to publicly funded early childhood education. And most of these are 3-year-olds. And so continuing to urgently call for investments across our public-private system to get kids 2 years of quality early childhood experiences prior to kindergarten to put them on track for success is critically important. Next slide, please. We also know that we can't just focus on 3 and 4-year-olds, and we have to recognize this as a system. And I know that many of our providers, from our family day homes to our child day centers, the economics of childcare depend on being able to serve these diverse age groups, and that includes school age as well. But we do know that because we have historically funded infant and toddler care, particularly the child care subsidy program, not as much with early Head Start, at a level that's way below what it costs. And we know that when we hear from our child care providers that infant care is absolutely the most expensive, largely because of the ratio requirements, which makes sense. None of us want to put 20 infants, right? If you think about a kindergarten ratio, right, in infants, nobody wants to put 25 kids, right, with a with 25 infants with any type of caregiver, right? We need a much smaller ratio of educators to the babies. And so that makes it much more expensive. And so what you see is a lot of our, only half of our programs even in fact accept kids 1 and younger, right? And that is just has to do with operationally, it's just more expensive, and you have to turn this cost over to parents because the child care subsidy program doesn't fully pay for that. And it makes it operationally hard to run your center. We do have about 1,000 infants who we serve, but that's about 5% of the overall program. And again, we collectively across Early Head Start, which also has very low ratios, and the child care subsidy program, we serve about 9,000 infants and toddlers, but that only represents 6% of those who might be eligible and in need. So, again, as we think about this push both at the state level and national level to serve more 3-year-olds, which is absolutely needed, we have to be really thoughtful and cognizant of how we continue to tackle infant and toddler access as well, because if not, we will risk making infant and toddler care even less affordable. Next slide, please. And lastly, I know, again, I noted this earlier, right? We have a significant portion of our child care subsidy program that are school-age children. And I know I've been asked the question, well, aren't you all focused on birth to 5? Why not sort of, encourage more use in the younger ages? And I think there's sort of two things that give me pause there in terms of really trying to shift away from what has become a kind of an established way that we run this program in the Commonwealth. I think the first of which is we do hear from providers that these school age programs, particularly in the last year, with all that we've been through, have been, just a lifesaver for working families or families in school who need full day, full year, right? And no one's allowed to leave a 6-year-old alone, right? So like they have to be sort of served somewhere. We also hear that because of the larger ratios, that these can help cross-subsidize the infant and toddler classrooms, right? And we wouldn't want to inadvertently pull away these dollars and then actually make infant and toddler care less accessible, because these classrooms help subsidize the overall operations of the center. I should also note, having done a little bit of research on out of school time, and I know that we've got that represented on this committee, these are also dire need. We're facing wait lists across the Commonwealth for out of school time. We know that when we look at some of the things we've shared with you around learning losses, that that our 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds desperately need these services too. And so it doesn't quite neatly fit into our vision around school readiness, but we also recognize that this child care subsidy program plays an essential role in supporting kids, families, and providers. And so, kind of wanting to sustain that while I think right-sizing some of our rates and eligibility for younger families. So again, these are some stats here. And wanting to share with that. And again, we're proposing that we continue this type of investment, even though it's slightly separate from our core mission of school readiness, because we think that these investments in these programs actually support that goal of school readiness, because it's the same centers and programs. All right, well, that was exciting to share those insights. It's fun to kind of take all the various points of data now that we're unified under the Board of Ed and Department of Education and start to think about this information in different ways. But you might say, well, Jenna, what are we going to do about it? Because clearly what you've presented is challenges around access and choice. And what I'm going to share now are just some ideas that we will share with the board when we talk. Now, again, nobody's voting on anything next week. This is not a kind of a policy decision. This is just helping our board to think about what's possible. So if you look at the first one around preschool, and again, this is a little bit more focused on 3 to 4 year olds. Here are some of the strategies, if we can move to the next slide, around access and choice in preschool. And so again, thinking both about how we increase eligibility on the demand side and the per child funding. We know that we have to address the cost of care. You're going to hear us across the board talk a lot about the true cost of care and how we think about calculating, not necessarily based on a market, which really is based on what parents can pay, right, and how much they make, versus what it actually costs for you all to provide a service. We're going to continue to look at supporting this public-private mix. I think that has worked very well for Virginia and makes sense to continue to forward, whether it's community providers through the Virginia Preschool Initiative, whether it's the mixed delivery program, or it's child care subsidy program. making sure that there are options in communities that meet families' needs. Schools are part of that mix, but so are our private programs. We're going to work to continue to build a system in Virginia. I recommend that we think about at least 2 years of pre-K, right? So that kids can benefit from that much in the model of Head Start for more than 50 years, right? There's 3 to 4 year old continuity that puts you on track for school. And then we've really used waitlist, right, as this way of kind of capturing family demand and then sort of focusing on whether it was in DPI or child care subsidy program under the leadership of the Department of Social Services. How do you make more folks eligible? You create wait lists where needed, and then you focus on getting those wait lists served, right, as you kind of grow over time. If we'll move to the next slide, please. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the things to think about as we think about the child care subsidy program. So still notice some similarities here. Again, thinking about how we maximize what the federal government sets forth and make as many families as eligible as possible. While also addressing the funding. I know we've heard from many folks in this group about, we got to fund at the cost of care, right? Otherwise, we're just operating at a deficit. And when that all kind of comes out either on the shoulders of the director or in the compensation for our educators, we need to recognize that we've got to support families who are looking for work. It is very hard to take a job, take more shifts, earn more money for your family if you don't have access to stable childcare. And we also know that our moderate low-income families are really struggling as they want to work, they want to sort of pursue additional advancement and educational advancement, but like if their paycheck doesn't cover the cost of childcare, they're in an impossible situation. And really kind of being thoughtful about how we support as many working families and those who are pursuing work. True cost of care, shifting to funding programs based on enrollment rather than attendance, and we've gotten much more generous in Virginia in terms of absence days, so that if somebody has to miss time because of a COVID exposure, because of something going on, that the provider sort of receives that funding so they can stabilize their operations. And last but certainly not least, whether it's through our child care stabilization grants program, whether it's through our educator incentives that are going out, attaching as many rewards to our child care subsidy program to get as many programs as possible participating, so that there are a lot of options for families across the Commonwealth. And so we like the child care subsidy program includes this incredible mix of public and private providers. We want to make sure that we reduce barriers and increase incentives and rewards so that every provider wants to be a part of the child care subsidy program. That would be our goal. Nobody will be required, we're not requiring, it's incentives here, but really encouraging all of our programs to take these important vouchers is a part of our strategy. So with that, lots of ideas there. I'm sure folks have responses there. Basically what we'll say, and I know it's like, all this build up and then what, but really just helping our board kind of understand where we are, what potential strategies are, which things we've been thinking about. And then as we start to think through with the upcoming transition, with the General Assembly in 2022 ahead of us, with regulatory opportunities through the Board of Education, there are different means to put in place some of the strategies that I just described. So some of them, like a lot of the language about the Virginia Preschool Initiative, is in the appropriations language, that's our budget. There are other things we helped expand eligibility for the child care subsidy program through legislation last year. That's House Bill 2206. Other aspects are regulated, like through the child care subsidy program we might be taking to the board. And then there's other areas where we've helped tackle some of these things, like increasing mixed delivery, funding it at the actual cost through COVID relief funding. So again, we're not asking them to vote on anything next week, help them kind of start to think through strategically across these areas, these different levers, how will we work together with you all and with them to think about this goal of increasing access to make sure that every child in the Commonwealth has the opportunity to come ready. All right, Shaki, let me pause there. I know that was a lot and I probably got a little excited, but let me see what kind of questions or comments folks would like to make. And again, we invite you to listen in next week to the working session as we walk the board through this. They won't be voting on anything, but I think it's important to kind of help educate them on the landscape and understand how important access and choice are to the work that we do.
Jenna, I'll start. I have a question and then a comment first and then a question. on the who's eligible chart, just as a point of clarification for Head Start is that we can serve up to 10% of our enrollment with over income families.
Got it. Not
so-
35%.
No, what you have there is also correct, but we also have 10% of our enrollment can be students.
Oh, got you. Add another point. Got you. Yes.
Yep. And then at the bottom, in terms of local criteria allowable, not really the term criteria, but we do use our community needs assessment to identify our enrollment priorities. So for example, we may have in the Newport News area, we're in a choice neighborhood community where we have families that are transitioning, and so they may not technically be more eligible, but their priority for enrollment may be greater than a family that's not in the choice neighborhood. They may get additional enrollment points, which will put them higher on the list for enrollment. So I don't know if that's significant enough to note there in the local criteria, because outside of the eligibility of age and income, we do have those local factors that determine our enrollment priorities. So I guess that's just a point of clarity.
Absolutely. Yes. No, we can make some adjustments there.
And then, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I just see a question from Bev, but let me let you finish first, Shaki.
I'm sorry. And then just on the, this is a question on the data charts. If this data includes, and you may have said, and I missed it, but does this data include Head Start slots that are outside of Department of Education grantees, like community action programs, as well as like private Head Start centers? Is that data included into these slots and availability?
Yeah, so this is the full, as we understand it, funded enrollment for the state for both early Head Start and Head Start.
Okay, and then last question, and then I'm going to let whoever else is next ready to go. Do we consider, we have more families as we think about our waiting list and families that are eligible for preschool services, what families choose to homeschool? Do we have any data to factor in what portion of those unserved families actually want services or choosing to do homeschooling instead? Because we're seeing an increased number of families, at least in our communities, that are choosing not to enroll in family day or publicly funded childcare programs. They're going with more of a homeschool model.
Absolutely. No, and that was, we are so close to getting a better sense of that. That's a really great question, Shaki. I think just as a way of reminder, and we shared this data with you all earlier, we had historic under enrollment. We had, we lost a tremendous percentage of children participating in childcare subsidy program last year, Virginia preschool, early childhood special education, and in Head Start, right? And that was a combination really across programs, and was at sort of greater than what we saw at any other age band, right? When we compared some of that data to say the K-12 under enrollment, right? Kindergarten was next, and then it really sort of, it was much more stable across the first grades through 12th grade. And we are, I think we will have that maybe information by next week. We've been working very closely with our data folks to get a better understanding of where we are with enrollment. I know folks are asking about kindergarten, asking about preschool, asking about kids with special needs. There's a huge question mark about, which families feel safe and comfortable to come back, who may prefer at-home learning, whether that's a permanent preference, right, or still is a response to the pandemic. And so that is something that we can definitely bring back to a future meeting. We basically do a lot of those counts in September and October, and so we just don't quite have that data yet, but we will in time for a future meeting. We also, I should note, do a family survey with the preschool development grant. And I know we've asked questions about preferences around in-person. And so I'll ask Becca to flag for me whether we want to kind of bring some of those results back to a future meeting as well, because that surveys tend to be the best way right now to understand what's going on for families. So
Jenna, I have a question also on that
Yep.
who is eligible slide, if we could possibly go back to that
Yep.
slide. And it's really just a definition question. How is Virginia currently defining at risk of not being ready? I feel like I had a handle on this about 5 years ago, but then again, I feel like the definition has changed over the years, and I gotta be honest, I've lost track of it. Is it all just FPL related, or are there other parameters?
I think that's actually part of our strategy. So it's a great question, Clark. And if you're feeling like it's slightly shifting, then you're spot on, right? Because we have been expanding it thoughtfully and strategically in response to this charge around school readiness. And partly it's enabled or sort of aided by the establishment of the Virginia Kindergarten Readiness Program, and to be able to look at more details at which kids do and don't have the opportunity to come to kindergarten ready, and that isn't just defined by income, right? That there are others, even as Shaiki just described, there might be other risk factors at play. Where possible, I think both with the Virginia Preschool Initiative through the Appropriations Act and mixed delivery, as well as with the Child Care Subsidy Program, trying to increase the number of kids and families that might be eligible. Still a focus on risk, right? Still a focus on prioritizing those who might be historically underserved or furthest from opportunity, right? This is not, we're not talking about universal here, right? This is still highly targeted, but we have given, for example, locals a lot more flexibility with VPI, right? And largely because we know in some communities, there's not necessarily even a match between Head Start and the number of kids that are there. And so really letting VPI go much higher, think about other risk factors, right? That might sort of play in. And it's also not noted here, but they can even ask for it to go above 15%. And so we have a lot of VPI communities that have expanded that. And then our communities, and then sort of be able to serve more. And that also reduces some of the pressure for just the most low income 3 and 4 year olds. We had for the first time some new VPI programs in the Commonwealth where folks were like, I might not have people who are income eligible, but I know that these kids are coming in not ready for kindergarten. And we've been able to use this language in the budget to allow more flexibility there. Similarly, we used this law last year that came from Fillercorn to both consider job search and to increase the income amount, right? So again, if we had all of these families employed, making sure that they could access stable childcare so that they could get another job, right? Take on shifts are two places where we have gotten more eligible, or sort of more families are eligible than they have ever been before. We've tried to align the VCF mixed delivery eligibility with VPI, so it's kind of more flexible. And I think, including really being thoughtful about inclusion and making sure that children with special needs are priority. So what you're feeling, Clark, is spot on. And we think that that's one of the more thoughtful ways, right, to kind of grow the program. And that goes kind of to Vivian, to your question, if you increase eligibility sort of thoughtfully, you then are able to keep a wait list and you understand, right, who might want this, and then you expand. It just helps us kind of, continue to grow thoughtfully while targeting, right? Because we do want to make sure that our kids who are at risk of not having the opportunity to come together remain the priority. So, continuing to kind of thoughtfully expand eligibility is something that we will recommend to the board, and as well as be able to provide data and information to our elected officials on.
Jenna?
Yes.
I just want to tell something that happened recently, and I witnessed some kids that were already 5, and a family walked to my center. I said, how old is the child? 5. Well, he should be at the school. She didn't know anything about it. She didn't know how to go in. And this child, we were trying to help her. He was too late for preschool. And we went to the school and we talked to somebody. There were some requirements that she couldn't provide at the moment. But for the preschool kids that were not born here, they don't have birth certificate, they couldn't apply through the childcare system. So I don't know, there's a lot of kids that are facing with this problem, families that are facing with this problem. So I don't know what we can do to help them, because they are going to be here. They are not leaving. They are stuck here, and the kids are there. They are playing on the streets, but they cannot attend childcare centers.
No, that's a great point, Sue. And actually, another way, just to add to your question and Clark's point, we actually expanded. We said for the first time ever that VPI this year, through a waiver via Superintendent Lane, could serve at-risk 5-year-olds. We realized that a lot of folks, they might be biologically 5, but for a variety of reasons might really benefit from the Virginia Preschool Initiative, right? And provided that flexibility. Again, it's a local decision, right? It's a parental decision. We're not gonna kind of quote unquote hold any young children back, but wanted to provide some flexibility, noting that in that case, maybe this 5-year-old would benefit from preschool. We certainly are working, Cecilia, and that's helpful feedback to think about, how do we serve our diverse kids and how do we kind of make it's easier to enroll in these programs. I see Vivian's question here about a more coordinated system, and for all of the complexity of the system, which, as I explained before, there's some rhyme and reason before it. It doesn't mean that we need to force families to navigate these mazes. And so I know that we're working at the state level, as well as working with our local and regional partners to think through, how do you coordinate enrollment better? How do you provide better information to families? How do you offer navigators, potentially, Cecilia, right, who can help families along the way? How do we think about places where, if the federal dollars don't allow it, we use the state dollars to potentially support some of these kids and families? So all of those things have to be in play as we think about moving the needle on school readiness. I see Shaki also has a question about VPI programs now required to have 10% children eligible for special education. We set a target in the appropriations, or the General Assembly rather set a target in the appropriations language last year. No consequences, but really encouraging each of our VPI classrooms to be inclusive of children with special needs. The target, and we ask each of our classrooms to work, each of our programs rather, to report back on that. Great questions and feedback. This is very helpful as we go into next week, and I appreciate being able to walk everybody through it. Excellent. If you do have any additional insights or think we could be more clear or we've missed anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. I mean, again, you all are, even though these are updates, this really helps prepare us to present this to our board next week and be able to walk them through it. So I really appreciate you putting your eyes on this, as well as any feedback that you've got for us in addition to these fantastic questions. All right. Our next item is a proposal for biennial re-benchmarking for the Virginia Preschool Initiative. Literally all of those have multiple syllables in them, but basically our General Assembly required us to take a look at how we fund the Virginia Preschool Initiative and compare it to how we fund K-12, right? So you'll notice a lot across our work around, really, as we put these things side by side, I sort of thinking kind of differently about how we might do things. So that's what I'm going to share now, if we can go to the next slide. So basically, the way that our law works is they say you should calculate the cost for the K-12 system based on what it actually costs school divisions to run K-12. So you look at what are called the standards of quality, what we expect of a kindergarten classroom, and then we fund based on that. And so what the General Assembly asked the Department of Education to do is to say, take that same logic, take that same methodology, and let us know what it would look like for pre-K, right, for the Virginia Preschool Initiative. They talked about, why it might be needed, right, helping to kind of understand what are the advantages of funding based on the cost of care, engaging stakeholders like you, thinking about what it would require in terms of legislation or budgetary amendments, and then walking through kind of, actually crunching the numbers, which I'll share at the end, like what it would cost and how that might be different from where we are today. Next slide, please. This is just a brief history. So since 1995, the General Assembly, it's a state preschool program, right? So it's not federal, it's entirely state funded, has appropriated state funds to support VPI. And in that language in our budget, it always specifies a specific amount. Here is the per child amount for Virginia Preschool this year. It's not that simple though, of course, right? This is early childhood, nothing is that simple. That amount, the state only pays a proportion of it. So for instance, right, the state might say it's $5,000 this year, but we only pay a portion of it. The locality has to make up the match. And that match is really based on your composite index, which is, or your local composite index, which has to do with kind of the wealth or affluence of your particular community, right? So less affluent communities pay less than match, more affluent communities pay more than matched, although it's capped at 50%. But basically it means that the state pays slightly more per child in poorer communities, slightly less per child in more affluent communities. The per pupil rate, so how much the state sets forth, right? And again, remember, it only pays a portion of that, but that per pupil rate for the Virginia Preschool Initiative has incrementally increased each year. So there hasn't really been a standard process for determining that, right? So like some years like, we'll go 5%, we'll go 10%. For 3 or 4 years running, there was no change, right? Even though we know there's things like inflation or other costs to operate. And so part of why the General Assembly asked us to look at this is to say, well, how different now, right? 20 plus years into doing this, 25 plus years into doing this, how different are what we're funding between what it actually costs our school divisions and our community partners to run VPI. Next slide, please. This gives just a little bit of background on some of this recent work, right, and why there might be a difference between what the budget sets forth and what it might cost. As many of you know, there's really been an increased focus on Virginia Preschool in the last year. As Clark talked about, kind of expanding the eligibility, strengthening the quality. A lot of this was in response to a really important study in 2017 under the General Assembly, the Joint Legislative Audit Commission, what's also known as JLARC, calling for some additional investments in the Virginia Preschool Initiative. We then worked with this governor to produce Executive Directive 4 findings, right? We went out with Superintendent Lane and Commissioner Storin across the state to talk with folks about how VPI was funded, who was using slots, who had wait lists, where there was some of the challenges there. And then we've worked kind of historically through the budget in the last few years to increase the VPI amount, as well as to add what's called a community provider add-on. And that's recognizing when folks who are in private childcare run VPI that they tend to have higher costs, largely because they can't use some of the more general dollars that school divisions often use to float or to subsidize their VPI classrooms. Right, and as you'll see in a second, what the state provides, even if you think that proportion, doesn't actually cover the costs of VPI classrooms. So at least when we were working with community providers trying to cover more of the full cost of running the preschool classroom. Next slide, please. So basically, this is just kind of how to think differently about this. And what you do is you take a look at what the requirements are, right? And then what the average costs are. So each year, the Department of Education gathers data from school divisions, looks at what it actually costs, what's required in law or regulation, and then that spits out a number on how much each classroom needs to be funded at. And so what we are going to do is the same thing with VPI, which is what's required, what does it actually cost based on actual data coming from school divisions, and then that will help us spit out a number for determining the cost of quality preschool via VPI. Next slide, please. The key thing to sort of think about when you're like, well, what are these standards of quality? What might they be? Think about the kind of, if you think about the cost of a preschool classroom, it's really about the educators, right? Their salary, compensation, and benefits. And then some of the other things that are important to supporting that classroom, everything from the utilities to the cost to clean, to the things like this counselor and the nurse, right? All that kind of go into the child's experience. And then you've got to make adjustments, really, that there's quite a bit of variability in different areas of the state on compensation, and making adjustments to that. Next slide, please. So if you, what what we've done then, and what this report will ultimately show, is that historically we've been underfunding VPI, that we have not fully accounted for all of the costs that are actually going into these classrooms based on what school divisions and partners are doing and what's kind of set out in expectations in terms of the regulation or the law. Normally we focus on the teacher and the aide, but we're not really recognizing some of the costs of materials, the transportation, which is required costs, the school counselor support services, art, music, physical ed, things that are expected as part of our early learning development standards, technology, the community provider add-on. We have to include all of that if we truly want to cover the cost of offering VPI. So if you do that, right, so if you basically say, what would it take? And we're again, think of this as a report that is guidance or advice to the General Assembly. What this report does is walks you through all of what I've just described, says now taking the actual numbers from Virginia from the last 2 years, right, in terms of actual salaries, actual kind of compensation, what we typically spend on instructional support, costs related to transportation, right, sort of actuals, not just hypothetical, actual numbers, then it will basically kind of, it helps spit out a number. Like you basically create a spreadsheet and this gives you this information. We have run those numbers and this report is what we'll share with the General Assembly that kind of, that does this for them. Next slide, please. And then it really, in terms of the plan for this, then within the kind of other key piece is what it would take to change it, right? So again, as I said before, our current budget or the kind of law of the land on VPI just sets an amount, right? And it doesn't actually say that it needs to be based on cost, nor does it call for this re-benchmarking in the same way that the budget does call for that for K-12. And so we will let the General Assembly know that these are the steps that would need to be taken if you wanted to align how we fund the Virginia Preschool Initiative with how we fund K-12. We also have an appendix that will crunch all the numbers, right, and look at in the different areas of the state, particularly in places where compensation is much higher than the very competitive Northern Virginia area, how it might differ. And then it will be up to the General Assembly, again, the entity that sets the amount for VPI, to make this decision as to whether or not they want to move to this re-benchmark rate and potentially in the future continue to expect us to re-benchmark, right, or to run these numbers every 2 years. Just so you understand what the difference might be without forcing you to go through multiple spreadsheets. Right now, we're at about the current rate in our budget is $7,655, right? 7,655. If we ran actual numbers, it would be higher. It'd be 8,446. So you see a difference in terms of how we currently fund it and our kind of more sporadic increases over time versus something that actually looked at cost based on Virginia data, closer to the cost of providing the services required by the law or by the budget. So that's the kind of the big aha. There's not any action that our board can take on this, but we wanted to walk you all through this so that you have an understanding of that this work has been done. This report ultimately will be published. We're still waiting to see when that will be, and that there is a difference even for our VPI program. We know this is much more pronounced on our child care subsidy program, but there's a difference between how we fund these programs versus what it actually costs to operate these programs. And so we're systematically, this is just one example, looking at how we fund programs based on the actual cost to operate rather than some of these other mechanisms. I feel like that was a lot of information again, but let me pause there, Shaiki, and see what questions we have.
I don't see anything in the chat box. Let's see.
I didn't have a question. This is Tina from Henrico. I didn't have a question, but I will say it was great information to hear. I often have lots of conversations within our school division about, because we often, with even our local match, have to go beyond even what the local match cost is for us. But we always get those questions about the nurse, the school counselor, who's supposed to, kind of take care of that piece of it when we have the additional preschool students. So I love the conversation that's happening right now.
Thank you, Jenna. I think it's a lot of information and a lot of things going on my head right now. Okay, this is going to mean that now will be new requirements for the teachers. Do we need to have something else? What is going to happen? How
No,
this is
that's
going to-
actually, Cecilia, that's incredible. This is one of those few things that's no new requirements. This is us actually just running numbers saying based on it exactly as it is, no new requirements, no new expectations. It's just shedding the insight, using numbers to share that already we are underfunding you based on what you're doing, right? So it really is, this is saying without adding any additional requirements, right? Because we know we've done a lot of that in recent years, that there is a gap between what we say we expect and what we fund, right? And now what the General Assembly will do with that, that's not within our control, but it's not saying, in some ways it builds the case for not adding additional requirements, right? Because we don't actually fund for what we expect now. But that's a great question. I know it wasn't, the action step isn't clear here, but no, this is just saying, and I think we find similar things with childcare subsidy. We're just trying to use data to show in numbers what many people feel, right? Which is that I feel like I'm not getting fully funded for what I'm asked to do. And this just numerically illustrates that, I think is maybe the best way to describe it.
Okay, thank you, Jenna. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, we will have this report. And again, we want to be very transparent and thoughtful with you all around sharing things in advance. So again, once this is published, it will go out and we will be sure to kind of to loop back to you. But again, no action step needed right now. Just wanted to require by the General Assembly to engage you all on it. And so we wanted to make sure we did that. And obviously, I think if anything, it just loops back to one of the strategies from the prior session is our first step is getting the data to engage our stakeholders, those who make the decisions, whether that's folks like our governor or General Assembly, to help them understand that there is a disconnect between what is required and what is funded, right? And just putting numbers to help illustrate that point, we think is a really important step now that we're unified under one shop. All right, let's go to the next. All right, so important note as we sort of think about sort of some of the challenges that folks are facing, and I think what was behind Cecilia's comment and absolutely true and what we are hearing from everybody that we talk to right now is please don't put one more thing on me because I am at a breaking point. And want to talk a little bit about what's causing some of that breaking point and then what we're doing about it. This is a bit of an unusual update item for us because there's not necessarily anything that we're taking to the board or publishing on it, but this is so important and what we hear from everybody we talk to. So we wanted, if you guys are okay with it, to bring this item to you just to talk through what we're doing because this is what is top of mind for everybody who is in the sector right now. So I know we don't normally just bring random updates, but we thought this was important enough to bring to you all today. We can go to the next slide, please. I think everybody on the call tonight knows this, but I just wanted to share some headlines. I know folks in the Richmond area, this was on the news, investigative reporting last night. Regardless of your political proclivity or what area of the state you're in, every headline we see is saying that we are just facing real pronounced challenges on being able to attract and retain staff. And it is having an impact on our directors. I don't know if we've still got Clark or if he's run off to run the bus. We know folks are working in Head Start in the classrooms. We know folks in our schools are giving up all of their planning time to staff lunch and staff when folks are out. We know there's just tremendous impact kind of across the sector. And we know that it is most pronounced in our childcare sector where folks are paid least, and who these folks have been on the front lines for the last, guys, I counted it today, 19 months of this pandemic. You go back to March of 2020. Next slide, please. We know a big factor on this, and this is happening across the country, right? I should note, and I feel like I've talked to a number of Virginia providers who, I don't know if it makes you feel better or worse, who say like, I hear this is happening, but I also recognize this is happening nationally. And an AC survey showed that 4 out of 5 child cares across the state are understaffed, and that really nearly all of them are saying that low wages, low compensation, like the combination of wages and benefits are making it really hard to recruit new employees. Folks are retiring early, folks are leaving to go work at Target and Walmart. Like, it is just an incredibly difficult time to attract and retain staff. Next slide, please. We've heard this, and I think we've had conversations with the governor's office, our workforce advisor. I think we thought in the summer that maybe folks coming back from unemployment would help resolve this. Each of us has had a variety of hypotheses and thoughts on this, but I think it's starting to feel like a really persistent, right, lasting challenge. And so what we have a department in partnership with the governor's office and others have really been thinking through, what can we do about it? We have had advocacy from the Child Care Association, we have had advocacy from the Family Day Home Association, advocacy from kind of groups across the state around saying, like, I would like to serve more kids. I know families need this, but I'm really struggling with staffing. And so there are 5 areas that we wanted you all to know that we're working on. One is what I talked about earlier, is just getting folks funding, right? This flexible funding for the Child Care Stabilization Grant, putting all of the money out there and getting it all out to you within 9 months was kind of the top priority. Second, looking at how we can address some of these hiring barriers where possible. A lot of this stuff is written in law and code, and trying to think through what can be done. Third is offering flexibility on health and safety, so figuring out how we balance between keeping kids healthy and safe, but also providing as much give as possible during this incredibly stressful time. And I'll leave a little bit to, I'll talk to you in a second about what the General Assembly put forth in their budget in August that allows for a temporary increase in ratios and group size. And then finally, just, if anything, this work over the last few years, and harkening back to Cecilia's comment, right? Really recognizing all that you all do and all that has been put on you, and really thinking through how do we elevate the awareness about the profession. They're not workers, they're educators, right? They've played an essential role in supporting kids and families throughout this pandemic. And how do we think long-term about truly elevating the profession while we are looking to drive additional compensation? So 5 action areas that we're working on right now. Next slide, please. And Clark, you part-time forever, you found one, that's awesome. Sorry, I just saw the comment. So this is kind of a status update on those areas. So compensation, a couple of things to highlight for you. One is getting these grants, right? $440 million, that's the big money, right? And getting that out to you, getting that out in 3 rounds. And we actually, if you'll remember, we first talked about this being a year and 4 rounds, and we compressed it down to 9 months and 3 rounds because we knew you needed those dollars now, right? With maximum flexibility. We are very excited to announce that we had more than 6,000 educators sign up for the Early Childhood Educator Incentive this year. So we've increased it from $1,500 to $2,000 per year. And we thought we were gonna get 5,000 and we're over 6,000 this year. So again, hoping to work with providers to support those folks that are working 30 hours or more with kids in our publicly funded programs. And similar to what I just walked through, what we did for VPI, we are doing similar work for Child Care Subsidy. So you might say, Cecilia Clark might say, I feel like what you're asking me to do is not what you're funding me to do. We know that you feel that way. The market is flawed. And so it's a little bit more complicated, right? When we look at how we do this for childcare, but we are doing similar analysis right now and we'll work with the board, potentially the General Assembly in 2022 to figure out how we can fund the subsidy program closer to your actual cost to operate, not just the market, because we know the market is really just what parents can pay, and most parents can't afford to pay what you need to receive to operate. Hiring barriers. So we've got a law that was passed last year to require background check flexibility that should go into place, portability by January of 2022. The big issue that's top of mind for right now is that the federal government allows for provisional employment once you have either the FBI or the state criminal background check. But Virginia regulations don't allow that. And so trying to think through whether there's a regulatory action here, whether it's a legislative action, but how we might offer providers the ability to provisionally hire somebody who could work with kids. They have to be supervised by somebody who has a background check, but that would allow you to bring somebody on, train them, count them in ratios. You have to make sure there's somebody else in the room, right, in terms of the keeping kids safe. But right now, our regulations don't allow that. And so we're trying to figure out, is there a way to resolve that, and what would be the most expeditious, right, the most rapid way to do that. And as I'll talk about in our next item, we've got to do a notice of intended regulatory action. So that's that acronym NORA for the criminal background checks. And again, looking at, offering this provisional employment flexibility, adapting the regulations for portability, making some changes to address barriers there. Health and safety flexibility, we've got some new CDC regulations. I know we talked about a prior meeting. We normally do a 60-day implementation period. We expanded that to a 90-day implementation. We heard from all of you that when these hit in October, folks are like, I just have so much going on. Please give me more grace period around implementation. And so we did that. And as I'll talk in our next section, be working with you all starting at the end of this year to kind of streamline those regulations. I'll talk in a second about new ratio flexibility that the General Assembly charged us with. And then just wanting to continue to raise awareness about the professions. I want to share a new job board by Child Care Aware of Virginia that has gotten thousands and thousands of hits and is supporting our providers. And then we've also been talking with the Child Care Association, with Virginia Public Media about a statewide campaign to raise the profile of our child care and education and attract more educators to the field. Next slide, please. So there will be information coming out to the field likely within the next week or so about ratio and group size flexibility. And I wanted to make sure that this group was aware of that, understood the origins and what this means for the field. The General Assembly, in response, so our elected officials this summer were hearing loud and clear from providers who were really struggling with some of these staffing issues. And in response, they added language to the budget that gave the superintendent of public instruction, so that's Superintendent Lane, in consultation with the Commissioner of Social Services, the authority to adjust ratios in group size to go up by 1 child for group of children to 5 and 2 children for school age, public school through 12. It's temporary. Centers will have to request it in writing between, starting as soon as when this notice goes out, and it only lasts through the end of June. We, in response to this legislative mandate and what we're hearing from the field, feel that it's really important to put it out there, largely because we want to at least provide this flexibility. It's a choice. We have already heard from some centers when we announced this a few weeks back that they feel like it's going in the wrong direction in terms of quality for kids, that they're not comfortable with adjusting ratios, so that it just doesn't make sense for them. And we understand that, right? We think it's a trade-off between two not great options, right? Which is either increasing your ratios or basically forcing a child into unlicensed care or subsidized care, right? So again, and we feel like with that, we at least, and because we're required by our General Assembly to at least consider this, wanted to at least put this flexibility out there. What we'll do is we'll put out a memo from us with a form that folks will need to fill out that will basically say, here's what the law or the Appropriation Act says. Here's some considerations, right? Trying to keep in mind these trade-offs, right? Nobody, I think, really wants to increase ratios or group size, but we also recognize that these are extraordinary times. So think about, your how much size you actually have. Think about your staffing levels. feel free to kind of consult your licensing inspector if you want, kind of need additional guidance there. If it's something that you still think would make sense for your program, then you'll need to request the waiver through a very simple process to us. Really, that helps us understand who needs this, and we will do a double check. We don't want either programs that are under probation or where there have been health and safety concerns to kind of increase ratios, right? Very simple check. And then that the regulation does require that you notify families in writing, right? Which again, we'll just ask providers to do. So we will put this out there to the field. Again, it's an option, right? It will be a fairly simple and sort of straightforward process. Nobody has to do it. You don't have, if you do it for school age, it doesn't mean you do it for younger children. You might make different choices depending on your center or your program. And we will track it. We will kind of look at, kind of gauge and really be sort of thoughtful about ensuring that we're still balancing between keeping kids healthy and safe. But we also realize that if kids don't have options, that also can put them in harm's way, right? And so trying to kind of balance there. It lasts through June 30th. And again, we'll be prepared come session time if the General Assembly asks us, well, who's using this, who's not, are there other things that we need to do? We'll be in a place to at least educate our elected officials about that. All right, next slide, please. And I'm going to do a promo here because we've had sort of, I think that's like over sort of 6,000 hits on this and hopefully more as a result of sharing it recently. But Job Hub, if you are a provider, you get free access to post immediately to Indeed and all of the kind of the key sites, Google, LinkedIn. Helps you keep track of who's applying, who's interviewing, maybe who's not showing up for interviews. We know that's happening now. And then on the applicant side, we know like thousands of applicants are using this portal now. So again, it's promoting that. So with that, this isn't the solution, right? I mean, I want to be clear that there's none of these areas in which we're taking work sort of alone will solve this. This is an incredibly pronounced challenge, but wanting to reassure our providers that we hear them, that we understand and are hearing sort of loud and clear what you're going through, and we're racking our brains and working as closely as we can with stakeholders and elected officials to think about all of the ways in which we can support you, noting that there are both sort of a need for short-term and long-term approaches to that. As of yesterday, the link on this form didn't work. Oh, thank you, Kristen. We'll double check that. It definitely worked when we first did that, but we can double check that and we'll have Becca send it back around. Roberta had a comment on the recent session that the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation with the Chamber of Commerce was so valuable. It was really encouraging to hear business leaders talk about what they're doing to address the child care workforce crisis. We need to get this information widely disseminated on various media outlets. Absolutely, Roberta, that's a really important, partly, I don't often share headlines right in the slides, but a part of it is we put that in part just to help folks understand that it is useful, right? I mean, if we're not being heard from, right, if it's not top of mind for elected officials, then it's not a problem. And so I think we do agree with you that finally business leaders are paying attention, and we know that business leaders are incredibly influential to our elected officials. Great point. Other questions, concerns, pieces of feedback on some of this work? I think we'll probably come back to you all, continue to update you, because this just is absolutely the top of mind item. Yeah, Clark, were you going to say something?
Yes, I am. Jenna, thank you so much for bringing everyone's attention to this crisis. And Channel 6's piece last night, I thought was very well put together. It's on their website. If anyone missed it, I'd recommend they go and look at it. It's, as I call it, this is the pandemic after the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
The waiver for the change in ratios. My personal opinion is at my center, I'm not planning to change ratios, but I love having that flexibility where when the teacher calls out sick or whatever, I have that flexibility. So do you know yet if when we apply for that waiver, does that waiver need to be date specific or classroom specific, or can it just be more as, if needed, please give me this allowance? I'm not saying I'm going to do it, but if needed, I want to have that card that I can play. Of course, I would inform the parents ahead of time in writing, but Does it have to be a specific classroom, for example, that we're asking for the ratio?
We're still figuring it out, Clark. So I think that's helpful feedback in terms of, I don't think we interpret that language to suggest that it needs to be like on a particular day. I do think my understanding of the legislative intent there, and we're still working this through with our attorneys, is that it's intended to do just as you said, which is provide a little bit of flexibility. Again, noting that your families are aware, right? And so
Sure.
sort of thinking through how to kind of keep them in the loop and continually aware, but it is not date specific. And I think we might ask, and part of it is we might ask what classrooms it pertains to, and you would be encouraged to sort of include whatever classroom, right?
Sure.
And again, I think the same is true. Some folks might want to do it for school age, but not infant, and you're just clarifying that. But even asking for the waiver doesn't mean you have to do it, right? So I think that what we imagine is some folks might do it as a form of kind of insurance. And I think that's, again, squarely in line with the legislative intent here, which is what we're obligated to follow.
Sure. And the other is just a comment, not so much a question, but I want to thank you for pursuing the provisional employment language, possibly fixing that. As you know, there is so much training that we need to do when we hire a new employee. And if we have that ability to go ahead and get those wheels turning, as soon as that FBI fingerprint check comes back, that would be a tremendous help. So thank you for pursuing that.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you, Clark, for making that point. I think for us that run centers, it's very important to have the flexibility when the staff is out. I would support that idea too, if we can request for the waiver and just use it as a backup in case we need it. Thank you.
I have a comment about the background checks. We are not permitted to, quote, hire an employee without all of their paperwork being completed. We are having a lot of trouble with the central registry in particular. We have been able to talk to our state inspector about that, and I do feel as if she has given us an adequate answer. The issue is we're not permitted to hire that person. I'm not talking about putting them in the classroom. I'd like to hire them, train them, get all of the information out that we require as an employer before they enter the classroom. And we're not allowed to do that. And in my common sense thinking, I don't see why that is an issue. Shouldn't we be able to hire them, but not put them in the classroom until that paperwork comes back? Because I need those 2 weeks with that employee to train them. So I'm not sure if that is anything if there can be anything done about that. But to me, it seems a little counterproductive.
Absolutely. So, I'm able to respond to that because as a team, we've been looking at that very closely because we've heard this loud and clear, right? Both as a function of, in general, comprehensive background checks are taking longer. I mean, part of it, this is like this vicious cycle, right? You're needing to hire more and more, right? Then it's sort of more background checks are coming through, then it takes longer. So I think the simple way to understand it is that a lot of the regulation around background checks comes from the federal government, right? So through the Child Care and Development Block Grant Authorization, they are in a very unique way, because they're normally not this specific, very, very specific about these comprehensive background checks, right, for program for all of the states that take the Child Care and Development Block Grant, right? So license. They do allow for provisional employment upon receiving the results of the state criminal or the FBI check. The challenge, as we have unearthed it, is that Virginia regulations prohibit the hire, right? So it's like, this is one, for instance, in where Virginia has been more restrictive. The legal challenge is that Virginia is allowed to do that, right? So normally you would say, think back to constitutional law in high school, where the federal law, trumps the state law. But the way that this particular federal law is written, states do have discretion, right? They can have more narrow eligibility for the child care subsidy program. They can be more restrictive on their background checks. And so this is a case where our regulation is more restrictive. what we are brainstorming right now, and it's really good to hear from you all today, is how we could resolve that, like how you could go back to what the federal law specifies. And is there a way to do that via executive order? We could change the regulations, and we'd be willing to take that to Dr. Mann and the board, but normally regulation change, as we know, can take forever. And so really, putting that forward, and we'll talk about that in a second in terms of the NORA, but also while putting that forward, thinking about other ways, right? And really, I think the real question for us is, might there be an elected official out there who would be interested, right? I mean, I'm in the executive branch, I'm not allowed to put forth law, but might there be an elected official out there who, would be willing to say, I want Virginia to align with the federal requirements here and allow for provisional employment, and then that can go into effect much sooner than some other regulatory changes. So we hear you. It seems that this is what the federal government has specified. I understand that there are reasons that Virginia got more specific about this a few years back, but it does seem that we are hearing from more and more of you that this additional restriction is too much, right? And that you would find it incredibly useful to hire the person, start them working, you're paying them, right? So they're not going to take another job, and between the training and this and that, and you can with your other staff figure out how to keep kids healthy and safe, right? Which is they just need to be supervised until central registry, the other 5 states. And part of the reason that the feds did this, right, because certain things like the other states, like we can't control. And we know for those of you in the DC, Maryland area, like this is a huge issue, right, on the other states. So I think, we're more than willing to talk to anybody about kind of how this problem got to this problem. And again, we will talk to the board next week about opening up those regulations, and certainly would be a goal to address that. But also want to recognize that there might be faster ways than just the regulatory process. So, great point there, and something that I know we're talking a lot about with the governor's office, and very open to any elected official who might want to discuss that further. All right, we will check on this link and make sure it's operating. With that, that's actually a perfect segue to our last item, which is the licensing work group, which we've got to kick off in the next month or so, and then the notice of intended regulatory actions, which is the NOIRA. Every time I say that, I don't know, I'm going to date myself here, but it takes me back to, wasn't that creature that, remember the Domino's ads back in the 80s and the 90s, like the Noid? Remember that red thing with like the weird, and every time I say NOIRA, I sort of the Noid from the Domino's ads. So I don't know if you, now I'll just, you all have that image pop into your head every time we talk about that. But I just want to say Noid instead of NOIRA, but I think people might be like, I had 4 heads if I did that. But last but not least, wanted to take you through this first step in opening up the regulations. I think to address what Bev and Clark and Grace just noted is the need to change some of the background check regulations, and what, as a first step in our work together around the licensing work group to the general licensing regulation. You can move to the next slide, please. So we wanted to come back to you. I know we had initially hoped to kick this off in October, and then I will be, very candid with you all. We have been 100% focused on getting these childcare stabilization grants up and operational. As you might imagine, building a licensing platform and figuring out how to cut checks for $400 million takes quite a bit of work and effort. And so that, and we brought over Jeff and the licensing team. So we are a little off schedule, in all transparency. Always want to be candid with you all. We want to get our first meeting kicked off by the end of 2021. So again, some of you reflected to us interest in that. We still have your names. Anybody else who wants to be a part of that, don't hesitate to email Becca at any point. But basically, we're going to pull together a group. We're going to start by looking in at background checks, right, and some of the changes there. And then we're going to take on all 137 pages or whatever it is of the regulations themselves. We've got Jeff Williams, who's our director of early child care health and safety, on today, correct the name there. And again, we imagine a multi-month process where we systematically look at these regulations and focus in on how we balance between keeping kids healthy and safe, think about risk, right, and what we know today, what data we have about what really puts infants, toddlers, and preschoolers at risk, and what is the best way to support you all, to partner with you all to keep all of our kids healthy and safe. Right? That's the top priority. And we'll focus on the Child Day Center regulations first. So you'll hear more from us in our meetings in 2022, and I promise they'll be kind of like bigger items, which I think will lend itself nicely to what Becca described and Shaki described at the beginning in terms of longer items. We will also need you to weigh in, and I will say, as somebody who has led similar effort in different states, we're not all going to have the same opinions on this, and so being in person and being able to have a vote, right, on some of these will be important. And so just want to note, we'll always give you advance notice on the content, but this will be why we need to be in person, because we might see things differently, and wanting to have enough time and space and forum to be able to do that will be important. So our goal with Jeff and Becca and team is to get the group together, convene, and kicked off. We will include members from the Early Child Advisory Committee, and then if we have sort of other groups that we need to represent, and then we'll set forth a schedule for next year and then periodically come together. We can't bite off more than we can chew. We'll have to kind of do it section by section, but we will cover the entirety of the general procedure. All right, next slide, please. So the key thing, thinking of our dear friend the NOID or the NORA here, is that in order to open up regulations in Virginia, there are a set of steps you have to take. And the first one is letting the world know that you want to change something. And so that's what we're taking to the board next week. This basically sort of gives and the materials that we sent to you kind of give you a sense of what we'll share with the board. It doesn't say how we're going to change things other than very generally, right? It doesn't have that, so it's not a predetermined outcome. It basically says we are going to open these up. We think it's a significant enough change that it's going to be a repeal and replace, right? So sometimes we say, well, there's just this one little thing we're going to change, right? And that's how we sort of frame this. These are bigger deals, right? We've got things like portability. We've got to change the regulations more substantively. And so these are called repeal and replace, right? Again, that doesn't mean that we're saying or we're expressing to the board next week how we're going to change them. It just says that we think these steps have changed. That will help us take every aspect of the regulations into place, organize them, make them a little simpler for folks to follow. And then I think in case of the general procedures, really kind of go through everything, right? And what we've heard from you is that different people have different pain points or concerns. And so it's really important to kind of top to bottom and bottom to top to take a look at these general procedures and information for license. So again, first step, really important first step, but we are not having a conversation with our board next week that says, here's how we're going to change. We're just going to say, here's the order, here's what we're opening up first. And we want our board to understand that there is substantive work that's needed on both of these sets of regulations. Next slide, please. This is just the background, so just a shorter version of what is in the document that Becca sent to you in advance of the meeting and what we'll share with the board next week, which is what this is, right? Background checks, why we have them, kind of what they cover. It's a repeal and replace, right? We got to align with the federal and state laws. Again, as I noted earlier, we might need to do it faster than this, but at least to say that we want to align the regulations with the federal and state laws, and then to clarify and update any of the requirements. And then again, we know that there have been changes and these regulations are out of date, not to mention I think there's other concerns with them. So that's what we say about the background check. I will say, just so everybody knows, that this is probably more of an alignment exercise than being able to make this up. So while the federal government is remarkably specific on kind of background checks, and what I think we'll sort of start with the work group is kind of walking folks through that. But we don't have like some of the stuff where folks will often say, well, do you remember how it used to be, right? Where I could like hire somebody and wait for the results. Like, unfortunately, since 2016 and the federal government made these changes, like we can't go back, right? So I just want to kind of go into this work is slightly different from the general procedure work. because of the specificity, like the very specific detail around background checks that's in the federal law. So we go further than that in Virginia regulation, and we need to kind of correct that and align that, and we will do that. But I want to be clear that we can't really go back to 2014 because of the federal law. Even though I know some folks, I always hear that, and I've heard that in almost every state that I've talked with folks. Do you remember how it used to be with background checks? And then, but that's not something that states can control. And then the next slide. So general procedures is a little bit different. There's some parameters that are set forth in the federal law, but states have a lot more discretion when it comes to your general licensing procedures. And so again, as you all know, what we've shared with you, we need a comprehensive review of these regulations in partnership with you. And we will kind of work through these together. We'll then take those changes to the board. This includes licenses and types. We can't change who is licensed or not, right? Or who is exempt. That's spelled out in code. That requires the General Assembly to change. But just some of the detail about the licenses, the health and safety performance expectation, this idea of risk, right? And fundamentally kind of thinking through what are the things that put children at risk, and how do we think about kind of reducing or mitigating that risk, detail on some of the investigation requirements, that's some of the legal language like character and reputation, and then sort of kind of thinking through enforcement. And what I'm really looking forward to as part of a work group is both sort of hearing kind of, you know, all aspects of this, from what do we need to change in the regulations, how much of it is about interpretation and enforcement, and whether, you know, it's this kind of this line between where is it partnership and where is it enforcement, right? For our folks who are doing incredible work with kids and have been, right? How do we partner with folks to kind of keep kids, infants, toddlers, and preschoolers safe? And where there are people who are not following the rules, even with sort of lots and lots of guidance and supports, how do we take on more of an enforcement nature to our work? But I think right now we probably lean a little too heavy on enforcement, not enough on partnership. And so I think not only thinking about the body of these regulations, but also what are some of our policies. There's one note that I know that for those of you who know, and I know Jeff is sitting in on this today, like really thinking through how do we support our incredible licensing team, but also kind of strike this right balance on, you know, partnership where appropriate, enforcement where appropriate, and kind of collectively working together to keep our infants, toddlers, preschoolers, before and after school and summer camp kids safe is a top priority for us. And I know we've heard that from you as well. So excited to get this going. Know it's going to be a lot of work, and really appreciate, you know, Bev and Clark and others who said, I want to be a part of this. We will kick that off, you know, before the end of the year, and then look forward to, as part of our in-person meetings, getting substance. So again, when we take this to Dr. Mann and the board next week, not getting too much into the substance, just giving them a sense of what's to come and helping them understand all of the work we will do before we start to bring actual changes to regulation to them. And just as a note, Grace did put a note in here around some of the work around background checks. And so I think that's a really important point. Like some of this we can resolve and be kind of maybe more common sense, to use Bev's term, in the Commonwealth, and some of it might require some federal advocacy. And so, you know, wherever we can be helpful in that, please let us know. I think that's it. Am I correct here? Yes. We are. So let me hold there. This is like an unbelievable amount of information for 2 hours. I feel like you guys are all going to go off and take a nap. Let me pause and see. So and again, we know we're not allowed to take votes here, but just wanted to make sure that you are familiar with the what's coming next week to the board, both in terms of that working session and these two NORAs, or notices of intended regulatory action. Roberta asked a question. So the licensing review of the regulations will also include the school age programs. Yes, Roberta, in terms of the child day centers, it will. And I know we've actually heard, and we're being thoughtful about inclusion of school age programs on there, and really have gotten the guidance and feedback that we should think about maybe more designation, like if you serve this age group, these regulations pertain to you, right? Maybe a need within the regulations to do a better job of customizing, right? There are things that are really needed for infants that are not relevant for 7-year-olds, right? Some of the stuff on breastfeeding. for instance. And so I think we will make sure to have the stakeholder, the task force include school age representatives, as we will be thinking about school age programs, particularly only school age kids.
Jenna, I have two quick questions on current regs, and I don't know if you would need to defer this to Jeff if he's still on or not, but either way, I'll throw them out there. The version of the regs that was released on October 13th, which removed all the stricken information. However, it included all the historical notes, which then led it to be a very lengthy document. Is there a document available now to providers which just has the licensing code and does not include all the historical notes listed prior to each code?
So, Jen, if I can step in, the Clark released this week, I can't remember if it was this week or last week, lots happening, is a new manual. You know, in the past, there was a purple manual and there was the orange manual. We've released the new manual. It's on the child care VA website. Is that what you're referring to? Like kind of a new manual?
Exactly, yes.
Yep. So we just posted it within the last week. So if you go to the childcareva.com website, click on providers, and then go to licensed child day centers. There's a link to it says child license standards. That's the new book.
Perfect. And then thanks, Jeff. And then one more question. In this rewrite, there's language in there on definition for program director. And then it jumps to just some very brief language on aides. It seems to skip lead teacher requirements. Where do we find lead teacher?
Yeah.
requirements?
So the initial document with all the strike throughs and stuff like that, because lead teacher, nothing was changed. It wasn't included, but the manual has everything. So the link we just posted, it's 1 through 9,999 and all the ones in between. I knew I'd get you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff, will you please write a link on the chat? Can you enter the link on the chat? Thank you.
1 second. Sure.
Excellent. Are there any additional questions about what we're taking to the board next week and what that means for us as an advisory committee? All right.
And can I mention one thing?
Oh, absolutely, Jeff.
So one of the things that the beauty of all of us being all in this together now is we're doing much better as a state agency, communicating just everything. And we've actually implemented this week a new weekly newsletter. So really want to encourage folks to start just being on the lookout for that, because we're just trying to change how we communicate to give information faster. You know, sometimes it's just, hey, like for example, these codes, posting of the PDF, you know, that really doesn't require a really long, lengthy email, but just kind of an update. So just be on the lookout on that for Tuesdays and Wednesdays, because we really are hoping that will kind of help really just us with our communication. We're going to start putting stuff about how far behind their background checks, so what's going on with OBI. So we really think that's going to be a really useful tool moving forward. And just Erin's group has just done a fantastic job with that. And so we're all learning how to give her the information in a good way. So that's an apology to Erin for not giving her some of the information in the past the way it should have been given to her. So public apology here to Erin, because it's a fantastic tool that we're going to start using. So just want to encourage folks to be on the lookout for that.
Yep, absolutely. I think good point. And again, trying to increase communication without overwhelming, knowing that, and I keep thinking back to Cecilia, who's like, are you going to require one more thing? Because I can't handle one more thing. And noting that. So, well, with that, thank you all. I hope I didn't talk too fast. I'll ask Shaiki afterwards when we debrief, and she'll go a little too fast. But in all seriousness, let me turn it back to Shaiki, and I think we will wrap up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. No, I think that was perfect timing. You were actually done at 3:59. So, and we had time for questions and discussion. So that was perfect timing. I'm sure that there may be some afterthoughts or questions. And so I guess you would email those, any questions or afterthoughts to you and Rebecca. And I won't hold you any longer. I think we've gotten a wealth of updates and information today. And we look forward to our next meeting, which is in December, right? Or December or November? December, I believe. December. And so I think
December
it's safe to say happy holidays. I can't believe it, but I think it's safe to say that now. So happy holidays to you, and be safe, and we will see you in December, if not before. And we are adjourned at 4:06.
Thanks, guys. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank